Hello everyone and welcome to this video in which we'll be looking at the questions and solutions of a reading comprehension exercise in slot 1 of CAT 2023 paper. In a previous video, I have discussed how to read the passage and what is it that we're supposed to understand about the passage. So please, if you have not watched that video, I will highly recommend that you go back to that video and watch that video and then come down to the questions and the explanations. That will make life a lot more easier for you, right? So if you have done that and if you have tried to attempt the questions yourself, then here are the solutions for the passage in the paper which talks about post-colonial literature and specifically focuses upon a book where the author is referencing multiple different novels that talk about the Indian Ocean world. The novels which focus upon a southern-focused, a global south-focused perspective of the world. Right? So that's what the passage is about. So I hope you have read the passage and you have tried out the questions. Now let's look at the questions one by one. So first question asks us that on the basis of the nature of the relationship between the items in each pair below, choose the odd pair out. So we have to select that pair which has a different relationship between each other as compared to the rest of the options. So this is a slightly tricky question because it's not a very conventional question firstly, that it's not like we have to go back to the passage and find out what is true and what is not. We have to compare the two terms before and after the symbol for analogy, and we have to figure out that which two terms are differently related to each other. So looking at option A says Indian Ocean to slavery. Now, what is relationship between Indian Ocean and slavery? I can say that through the Indian Ocean, slavery was conducted, that slaves were transported from one place to the other, that is mentioned inside the passage. And also Indian Ocean world, the countries which are present in the Indian Ocean world did partake in slavery. So slavery was present in the Indian Ocean world. That is a relationship that is present in option A. Now look at option B. Option B says post-colonial novels and anti-colonial nationalism. So clearly in the very first paragraph, it is mentioned that post-colonial novels talk about or discuss anti-colonial nationalism, or that is the purpose with which they had written. So post-colonial novels have a sense of anti-colonial nationalism. So that is the relationship between the two parts of B. C says Indian Ocean novels outward looking. So Indian Ocean novels are outward looking. So post-colonial novels have a sense of anti-colonial nationalism is said in option B. C says Indian Ocean novels have a sense of outward looking. So B and C will definitely not be the correct answer because similar relationships are present between the two terms mentioned in both these options. And last option says D, option D says post-colonial novels and border crossing. Now, if you go back to the passage, you will realize that border crossing is being spoken about here, which is only present in Indian Ocean novels, right? The novelists who are focusing on the Indian Ocean at the center of the story. They were talking about border crossing. Post-colonial novels have been mentioned or have been talked about in the first paragraph, and here they are inward looking, or they're looking at the nation itself. So they are not looking at multiple different nations and migration between them. So clearly, these two are not related. That post-colonial novels and border crossing are not related to each other. Post-colonial novels are inside looking or inward looking. So D, the two parts don't have any kind of relationship between them. A, at least the two parts have some kind of relationship between them. I can say that Indian Ocean has a connection with slavery. Post-colonial novels has a connection with anti-colonial nationalism. Indian Ocean novels has a connection with outward looking. But post-colonial novels has no connection with border crossing. That's why D will be the correct answer for the first question. Okay, if this is clear, let's look at question 2. 2 says which of the following is not true about migration in the Indian Ocean world. So we have to figure out something which is not true. Keep in mind, we are not looking for something which is true. So we'll look at the options and whichever is not said about migration in the Indian Ocean world will be the correct answer. So going through the options one by one, option A says that Indian Ocean's migration networks were shaped by religious and commercial histories of the region. So let's go back to the last paragraph, which talks about migration, right? It is talking about in the fiction, sailors and travelers, not all European, African, as well as Indian and Arab characters, and are traders, the Kodas, runaway villains, missionaries. So this is why people were traveling across the Indian Ocean. So they were traveling across the Indian Ocean for trading. There were dhow ship captains. By the way, dhow ships are small ships which are used for trading purposes. Runaways who were fleeing a particular country, they were villains, which means that probably they're pirates. They were involved in plundering. There are missionaries, of course, who were in the process of spreading the word of God, and activists. So some kind of activism, maybe religious activism, maybe it's a social activist. They were traveling from one place to the other. So these were the motivations. So clearly trade and religion are mentioned here. So that's why A will not be the correct answer, because religious and commercial histories are shaping the migration networks of Indian Ocean for sure. Now looking at option B. B says migration in Indian Ocean was an ambivalent experience. If we don't know the meaning of the word ambivalent, then we have to leave out or we have to ignore this option for now. So let's ignore this. Let's read the remaining options to see whether we can eliminate any of the rest or not. C says geographical location rather than geographical proximity determine the choice of destination of migrants. This is written inside this paragraph here, right? This last paragraph of the slide talks about the fact that these connections were made possible by the geography of the Indian Ocean. For much of history, travel by sea was much easier than by land, which meant port cities very far apart were often more easily connected to each other than to much closer inland cities. So it was not proximity. So closer inland cities were not very well connected, but very far port cities were connected. So geographical location, more than proximity, is what was actually determining the choice of destination for people to travel to. So C is also given inside the passage. It is true according to the passage, so C cannot be the answer. Let's read D. D says Indian Ocean's migration networks connected the global north with the global south. Now, this is not said directly inside the passage, but let's see if there is any information which is contrary to this. So if I look for such a place inside the passage, I'll find that in the second paragraph in the first slide itself, you'll find that it talks about the world reveals a south-south interconnection. So the Indian Ocean world, that the traveling was happening to create an interconnection between the south and the south. In fact, throughout the passage, the author is talking about traveling within the Indian Ocean world itself. So travel between African nations, Arab nations, and India is what is being discussed. So it is not being talked in terms of connecting the south with any of the countries in the north. So maybe D is the answer. So B or D can be the answer. And if you're stuck between option B and D, you have to take a guess based on your understanding of what is written inside the passage, right? So the answer then is actually option D. But let's say that if we knew the meaning of ambivalent, could we have figured out the B is not the correct answer? So we could, because ambivalent means that when you are doing something in two minds, like you're not doing something with surety, that do you like chocolate or do you want to eat chocolate? Yes, I find chocolate to be delicious, but I also have a toothache. If you are stuck with this kind of a conundrum and you don't know what decision is supposed to be made, then you are having an ambivalent experience, that you are neither completely for nor completely against. And then if you decide to eat the chocolate, you're eating the chocolate a bit unwillingly. You know that you should not be eating it because you have a toothache, but then you really like chocolate as well. So you are favoring one side over the other, but does not mean that you are embracing something with 100% surety and certainty. Then you are having an ambivalent experience. So evidence for this is given inside the last paragraph, where it says that migration is often a matter of force. Travel is portrayed as abandonment rather than as that of adventure, which means that the people who wanted to travel, people who are migrating, they're not embracing travel with 100% surety. They were doing it because of some kind of a reason which was forcing them to travel. Like they did not want to travel, but some other reason was forcing them to travel. And that is why they were making the travel, which means that the decision to travel and migrate was ambivalent in nature. And that is why B is not the correct answer. B is given inside the passage. That's why D is the only option which can be the correct answer for question number 2. Right, let's move on to question number 3. 3 talks about all of the following contribute to the remapping as discussed in the passage except. Right, so which is not discussed in terms of remapping of the passage. So let's read the options one by one. We have to figure out all the options which are discussed in relation with remapping. Those will not be the answer. Whichever is not being discussed as a factor contributing to remapping will be the correct answer. A says cosmopolitanism originated in the West and traveled to the East through globalization. Now, if we go back to the passage, cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitan culture is only talked about in one singular sentence in the second last paragraph of the passage, which says that in these places, the novels in my book highlight instead a largely Islamic space, feature characters of color and centralize the ports of Manindi, Mombasa, Aden, Java, and Bombay. It is a densely imagined, richly sensory image of Southern cosmopolitan culture, which provides for an enlarged sense of the place in the world. Now, this is talking about the East and the South, which had a cosmopolitan culture. It's not saying that the cosmopolitan culture is coming from the North. So I don't have any evidence of option A being said that it is coming from West to the East. So that's why I will hold on to A. A can be a possible answer. Let's look at the rest of the options. Option B says global South as opposed to the global North was the first center of globalization. This is directly given inside the passage in this first sentence of the second slide here. that historical and archaeological evidence suggests that what we now call globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean. So globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean, which means that it was first present in the global south before the global north. As we mentioned inside the passage, so option B is not the answer. C says the world of early international trade and commerce was not the sole domain of white Europeans. Now, this is also being showed here that the themes were commonly found are mostly centered in Europe, assume a background of Christianity and whiteness, and mention places like Paris and New York. The novels instead focus on the travels of largely Islamic spaces and peoples of color, and they centralize around these ports. And in these ports, of course, trading is happening. So the Indian Ocean novels clearly are talking about the fact that the countries which are present in the global south were also actively involved in trade. It was not completely something which was a Western or a North or a global North culture. In fact, inside the last sentence of the passage itself, it says that what does mean, it does mean is that the African part of the Indian Ocean world plays an active role in its long, rich history and therefore in that of the wider world. So even in the perspective of the wider world, African ports and African part of the Indian Ocean was taking part in a lot of the processes like trade that has been mentioned inside the passage. So I would say that C is being talked about in the context of remapping, so C cannot be the answer. Let's look at D. D says Indian Ocean novels have gone beyond the specifics of national concerns to explore rich regional pasts. So this is directly spoken about in the second paragraph of the passage, that how the Indian Ocean world is described as a set of novel, which the Indian Ocean is at the center of the story. So it's not the nation itself. Unlike post-colonial literature, which was talking about an inward-looking and land-focused and nation-limiting kind of subject matters, the Indian Ocean novel is looking at countries which are centered around the Indian Ocean world. And it is not looking at one singular nation, is being told to us in the second paragraph of the passage. So D is also part of what is being said in the passage. So D is not the correct answer. There is also remapping that needs to be done in the minds of the reader. So D cannot be the correct answer. So the only possible answer then for 3 is option A, because this is not said inside the passage. Plus, we are being told about the cosmopolitan culture that does exist even in the global south and in the east. So that's why A should be the correct answer for 3. Coming to the last question. 4 says all of the following would weaken the passage's claim about the relationship between mainstream English language fiction and Indian Ocean novels, except. Right. So now this is a very important question to understand. Firstly, this is a critical reasoning question, which already makes it a bit complicated. So the question is asking all of the following would weaken the passage's claim. So the options we are talking about, which would weaken whatever claim is being made by the passage, which means that which leads to a conclusion which is opposite of whatever the author is concluding inside the passage. That would weaken the passage's claim. And then last word is except, which means that there are 2 negatives, weaken and except. So we are looking for an option that does not weaken the claim of the author mentioned inside the passage, which means most likely we are looking for an option which strengthens the claim, which is in keeping with, is in synergy with the claims that have been made by the author inside the passage. So that is what we are looking for as an option, which is the answer for 4. So we have to read this question very carefully in order to understand exactly what's been asked. If we read this and understand this, then let's go through the options one by one. Option A says the depiction of Africa in most Indian Ocean novels is driven by post-colonial nostalgia for an idyllic past. Now, we might not know the meaning of the word idyllic, but I hope we know the meaning of the word nostalgia. Nostalgia is when you look back at your past and you're very happy and you're very contented and you look back at it with a sense of happiness, at the same time a sense of sadness that, oh, that past was so beautiful and I cannot experience that ever again, and that is what is called nostalgia. Now, Indian Ocean novels are looking at the past, but clearly we have been told inside the last paragraph that this does not mean that Indian Ocean Africa is romanticized. So people are not looking at it as a fond memory. So it's not nostalgia with which the authors are looking at the past. So maybe A is weakening, but if you don't know the meaning of the word idyllic, then let's hold on to this for a bit. Let's move on to option B. We have to try to eliminate the option first. So B says the depiction of Africa in most Indian Ocean novels is driven by an Orientalist imagination of its cultural crudeness. Now, crudeness, which we should know, means not refined, right? Crude oil means unrefined oil. Crudeness means roughness. So are the Indian Ocean novels driven by the imagination that African culture was crude and was not refined? completely disagree, because in the part where they're talking about cosmopolitan culture, it's a densely imagined, richly sensory image of a southern a cosmopolitan culture shows that the culture was not crude or unrefined, or it is not being criticized as not being refined enough. It is being called a cosmopolitan culture, and the author will definitely disagree with this, that the African culture or the global South's culture was not refined. So B is weakening, definitely is opposite of whatever the author is claiming. So I'd say B cannot be the correct answer. Moving on, C says that very few mainstream English language novels have historically been set in American and European metropolitan cities. Opposite of this is mentioned here, that clearly it says that many of the, or most commonly found in fiction in English, those commonly found ones are mostly centered in Europe or the US, and mentions places like Paris and New York, which means the author is claiming that most novels were focused upon Paris and New York, and they were mostly focused on US and Europe. So see, the opposite of this is being said inside the passage. The very few is a keyword. The author is saying most mainstream English language novels are focusing on US and Europe, and that is why C weakens the claim made by the author. Is opposite of the claim made by the author. So C cannot be the answer. Let's read D. D says most mainstream English language novels have historically privileged the Christian white male experience of travel and adventure. This is indicated in the same sentence because they say that they assume a background. Most of the novels assume a background of Christianity and whiteness. So these novels are definitely focusing upon US, Europe, the experiences of Christian individuals, of white-skinned individuals, and although the male part is not directly mentioned, but I can say that this also kind of makes sense with respect to whatever the author is claiming. So at least 99% of the option is in coherence with whatever the author is mentioning. So D, I don't think weakens the author's claim. Whereas nostalgia is something that the author will not agree. So comparatively, at least, we should be able to eliminate A and mark D as the answer. On top of that, if we know the meaning of the word idyllic, then we will know that this A cannot be the answer at all. It is weakening the author's claim because idyllic means a peaceful, a beautiful, a very serene, calm, peaceful, beautiful kind of a past. So, of course, the author is disagreeing with this. The author is not saying that they had a very peaceful past. There were a lot of problems. People were forced to migrate because of things like slavery, because of women's rights not being present. So it is not a very peaceful past, and that's why A cannot be the answer, because it is the opposite of the author's claim, whereas D is in keeping with the author's claim. That's why D becomes the correct answer for question 4. So these are the answers to the exercise of this reading comprehension exercise from CAT 2023 slot 1. Thank you.